New York City had always been a city of power, money, and shadows. By the late 1970s, the streets were controlled by men who rarely appeared in newspapers but secretly ruled entire neighborhoods. These men were not politicians or businessmen. They were mafia bosses. Behind expensive suits and polite smiles, they commanded armies of soldiers who were ready to kill at a moment's notice. Entire industries were under their controlled construction, gambling, unions, and even parts of the government. But even in the world of organized crime, peace was always fragile. Every mafia family wanted more power, more territory, more money, and sometimes more revenge. For years, the city had been divided between several powerful crime families. Each one had its own leader, its own captains, and its own soldiers. They followed a strict code of loyalty and silence. Breaking that code could mean death. Yet beneath the surface of this carefully balanced power structure, tension had been growing. Rumors were spreading. Deals were being broken. Trust was disappearing. No one knew exactly when the situation would explode. But some people knew something big was coming. One cold evening in Brooklyn, a quiet Italian restaurant closed earlier than usual. The owner locked the front door and placed a small sign on the window that read "Closed for private event." Outside, the streets looked normal. Cars passait by, people walked home. The city continued its usual rhythm, but inside that restaurant, something historic was about to happen. One by one, expensive black cars pulled up near the entrance. From each car stepped men wearing dark coats and serious expressions. They didn't talk much. They didn't look around nervously. These men were used to danger. Each of them had bodyguards waiting outside while they walked inside alone. The first man to arrive was Vincent Moretti, a powerful mafia captain known for his intelligence and patience. Moretti was not the loudest man in the room, but he was one of the most dangerous. He believed in strategy, not emotion. His calm personality had helped him climb the ranks quickly inside his crime family. Tonight, however, even Moretti looked slightly tense. He walked through the restaurant slowly, observing every detail. The lights were dim. A single long table stood in the middle of the room. 7 chairs were placed around it. Moretti knew exactly what this meant. 7 men, 7 powerful figures from different factions of the mafia world. This was not an ordinary meeting. This was a meeting that could change everything. A few minutes later, another car stopped outside. From it stepped Salvatore Big Sal De Luca. De Luca was the opposite of Moretti in many ways. He was loud, aggressive, and known for solving problems with violence. Many people feared him because of his unpredictable temper. Stories about De Luca had circulated for years. Some said he had personally ordered dozens of killings. Others claimed he had once beaten a man nearly to death in the middle of a restaurant just for insulting him. Whether the stories were true or exaggerated, one thing was certain. No one wanted to make him angry. When De Luca entered the restaurant, he immediately spotted Moretti sitting at the table. Their eyes met for a brief moment. Neither man smiled. They had done business before, but trust between them had always been limited. De Luca pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. For a moment, the room remained silent. Then he spoke. "So, looks like the party hasn't started yet." Moretti simply nodded. "They'll be here." Another 10 minutes passed, then the door opened again. This time, 2 men arrived almost at the same time. Carlo Romano and Anthony Barone. Romano was known for being extremely cautious. He rarely spoke unless necessary. But when he did, people listened carefully. Barone, on the other hand, had a reputation as a smooth negotiator. He preferred making deals instead of starting wars. But tonight, even Barone seemed uneasy. The 4 men took their seats. No drinks were served. No food was brought. This was not a dinner. This was a negotiation. And possibly the beginning of something far worse. Another car arrived outside. From it stepped Marco Bellini, a rising figure in the mafia world. Unlike the others, Bellini was younger, ambitious, hungry for power. Some older bosses believed he was too reckless. Others believed he was the future of organized crime. As Bellini entered the room, he greeted the others politely before sitting down. Now 5 chairs were filled. 2 remained empty. Everyone knew exactly who those last 2 seats belonged to. They belonged to the most powerful men involved in this situation. Men whose decisions could determine whether New York would remain peaceful or descend into chaos. 20 minutes later, the final 2 cars arrived. The first door opened, and Don Lorenzo Ricci stepped out. Ricci was an old-school mafia boss who believed strongly in tradition and loyalty. He had ruled his crime family for nearly 2 decades. Many respected him. Many feared him. Inside the restaurant, all the men stood up slightly as Ricci entered. Even the aggressive De Luca showed a small sign of respect. Ricci slowly took his seat at the head of the table. Then everyone waited for the final guest. The last man to arrive. The man whose presence had forced all of them to attend this meeting. A black Cadillac pulled up outside. The driver stepped out and opened the rear door. From inside emerged Victor Castellano. Castellano was one of the most powerful mafia leaders in the entire city, but he was also one of the most controversial. Some believed he was a genius businessman who could modernize the mafia. Others believed he was too greedy, too ambitious, and too dangerous. As Castellano entered the restaurant, the tension inside the room became almost unbearable. He slowly removed his coat and sat down. 7 men now sat around the table, no bodyguards, no soldiers. Just the leaders themselves. For a moment, no one spoke. Finally, Castellano broke the silence. "We all know why we're here." His voice was calm but firm. "No games, no lies." He looked directly at De Luca. "You've been moving into territories that don't belong to you." De Luca immediately leaned forward. "And you've been stealing union contracts that belong to my family." The tension escalated instantly. Voices began rising. Accusations flew across the table. Deals that had been secretly broken were suddenly exposed. Hidden betrayals started coming to light. It became clear that this meeting was not just about negotiation. It was about power, control, and survival. Finally, Don Ricci raised his hand. The room fell silent. "We didn't come here to scream like children," he said slowly. "We came here to prevent a war, but deep down, every man in that room knew something terrifying. The situation had already gone too far. Trust had been broken too many times. Money had been stolen. Men had been killed. And once blood had been spilled in the mafia world, it was very difficult to stop what came next. Because revenge was not just emotion. It was tradition. It was law. And sometimes it was inevitable. Outside, the rain continued falling on the dark streets of New York. People walked by the restaurant without knowing what was happening inside. They had no idea that 7 powerful men were sitting together, arguing over power and territory. They had no idea that the decisions made in that room would soon lead to something terrible. Because within a few weeks, guns would start firing. Bodies would start falling. And New York City would witness one of the most brutal mafia blood wars in its history. And it all started with this one secret meeting. The restaurant had grown completely silent. 7 powerful men sat around the table, staring at each other like predators waiting for the right moment to strike. Outside, the rain continued to fall against the windows. Inside, the tension was thick enough to feel in the air. Victor Castellano slowly leaned back in his chair and looked around the table. "Let's stop pretending," he said calmly. "We all know the situation." No one interrupted him. For years, the mafia families of New York had maintained a fragile balance of power. Every family had its own territory, its own businesses, and its own rules. But recently, that balance had started to collapse. Someone had been secretly expanding operations. Someone had been stealing contracts. Someone had been killing soldiers from other families. And now everyone wanted answers. Castellano's eyes moved toward Salvatore De Luca. "You've been pushing into Brooklyn," Castellano said quietly. De Luca immediately slammed his hand on the table. "That's a lie." Carlo Romano leaned forward slowly. "Is it?" Romano asked. The room went silent again. Everyone knew something had changed in the last few months. Several small-time associates had disappeared. 2 loan sharks had been found dead in Queens. A warehouse owned by Barone's crew had been burned to the ground. Each event seemed small on its own, but together, they formed a dangerous pattern. A pattern that suggested someone was preparing for war. Don Lorenzo Ricci finally spoke. His voice was calm but powerful. "We are here to prevent bloodshed." Ricci looked directly at Castellano. "Explain why your men have been moving weapons through Staten Island." The accusation shocked the room. Castellano's expression didn't change, but inside, the temperature of the meeting dropped instantly. "Careful with your accusations," Castellano said. Ricci didn't move. "I don't make accusations without evidence." For several seconds, no one spoke. Then Marco Bellini slowly leaned forward. "I think we're asking the wrong question," Bellini said. Everyone looked at him. Bellini was younger than the others, but he had been gaining influence quickly. "The question isn't who started this," he continued. "The question is who benefits from it." Moretti narrowed his eyes. "What do you mean?" Bellini folded his hands together. "If war starts between the families, someone will gain new territory." De Luca suddenly smiled. "Kid's smarter than he looks." But Castellano was watching Bellini carefully, because Bellini's comment had revealed something important. Someone in this room might already be planning for war. And if that was true, then this meeting was already too late. Suddenly, the door to the restaurant opened slightly. Every man in the room instantly reached for the weapons hidden under their jackets. One of the restaurant workers stepped inside nervously. "I'm sorry, gentlemen. There's a phone call." The worker looked directly at Vincent Moretti. "They say it's urgent." Moretti stood up slowly and walked toward the phone near the bar. The others watched him silently. He picked up the receiver. "Yes." For a few seconds, he listened without speaking. Then his expression changed. Slowly, very slowly, Moretti placed the phone down. He turned back toward the table. "What happened?" Romano asked. Moretti took a deep breath. "One of our trucks was attacked." De Luca frowned. "What truck?" "The one carrying tonight's shipment." The room froze. Everyone knew what that meant. Weapons. A full shipment of illegal firearms. And if someone had attacked it, that meant the war had already begun. "Who did it?" Castellano asked. Moretti's eyes slowly moved across the table. "We don't know." Then he added quietly, "But 4 of my men are dead." The room exploded with anger. De Luca stood up immediately. "This is exactly what I was talking about." Barone slammed his fist on the table. "This is insanity." But Ricci remained calm. Too calm. "Sit down," Ricci ordered. De Luca hesitated, then slowly sat back down. Ricci looked around the table again. "This attack happened tonight," he said. During this meeting, that realization made everyone uncomfortable, because it meant something terrifying. Someone had planned the attack knowing this meeting was happening. Which meant someone here might already know who was responsible. Bellini slowly spoke again. "Maybe the attackers wanted this." "What do you mean?" Romano asked. "They wanted us to blame each other." Castellano nodded slowly. "Divide the families and start a war." But De Luca suddenly shook his head. "No." Everyone looked at him. This wasn't random. De Luca leaned forward and pointed at Castellano. "This was you." The accusation hit the room like a gunshot. Castellano's face darkened. "Careful." But De Luca didn't stop. "You're the only one here who benefits from chaos." Romano stood up quickly. "Enough." But it was too late. The fragile peace inside the room had shattered. Men who had worked together for years were now staring at each other like enemies. Ricci tried to calm the situation. "We will investigate this attack." But Castellano suddenly stood up. "No." Everyone looked at him. "If someone killed 4 men tonight," he said quietly, "then someone is declaring war." The words echoed through the restaurant. War. No one wanted to say it out loud, but everyone had been thinking it. Because in the Mafia world, violence was never random. Every bullet carried a message. And tonight, someone had sent a very clear one. Castellano slowly put on his coat. "This meeting is over." Ricci stood up as well. This isn't finished. Castellano looked directly at him. You're right. Then he added quietly, this is only the beginning. One by one, the men left the restaurant. Outside, their bodyguards immediately surrounded them. Black cars disappeared into the rainy New York night, but something had changed. Something dangerous. Within hours, rumors began spreading across the city. Associates started carrying extra weapons. Captains began calling emergency meetings. Everyone felt it. The storm was coming. Because in the shadows of New York, powerful men were already making plans. Plans for revenge. Plans for survival. Plans for war. And within the next 48 hours, the first major assassination would take place. An assassination that would officially ignite the blood war between the families. In the sprawling metropolis of Viridia, one name was whispered with a mix of fear and reverence: Don Antonio Morit Canon Tolas, the Lion. For 3 decades, he had ruled the city's criminal underworld, his influence stretching from the grimy docks to the glittering penthouses. His reign was absolute, his word was law, and his enforcer, a cold-blooded killer named Marco the Ghost, Bellini ensured that law was never broken. Moretti was more than a man. He was an institution, a seemingly immortal figure at the pinnacle of power. But immortality is a myth, even for lions. One rain-slicked evening, as Don Moretti enjoyed his customary espresso at his favorite secluded cafe, the myth shattered. 2 silenced shots, precise and deadly, echoed briefly in the night. The lion was dead. The city held its breath. An era had ended, and a bloody new chapter was about to begin. The immediate suspect was Marco Bellini. Who else had the nerve, the skill, and the proximity to pull off such a brazen act? Marco was the only one who knew the Don's routines, his security blind spots. The motive seemed clear. Ambition. The Ghost wanted the throne for himself. Overnight, the Moretti family, once a unified empire, fractured into chaos. The Don's 3 ambitious caposta, old-school traditionalist, the cunning financial strategist Isabella, and the hot-headed brute Nicolo, saw an opportunity. They had long chafed under Moretti's rule, and his death was the signal to make their move. Accusations flew, old rivalries reignited, and the streets of Iridia became a chessboard for a deadly game of succession. Everyone believed Marco was the assassin, the one who had cleared the way for this power vacuum. But Marco Bellini was nowhere to be found. He had vanished, living up to his nickname, the Ghost. While the capos tore the city apart in their struggle for dominance, Marco was hiding in the shadows, not as a fugitive, but as a hunter. He knew the truth. He hadn't killed Don Moretti. Someone else had. Someone incredibly skilled and daring, who had framed him perfectly. The assassination was too clean, too convenient. It was a calculated move designed to plunge the family into a self-destructive war, leaving the victor weak and the empire ripe for the picking. Marco's loyalty to the old Don ran deeper than anyone knew. Moretti had taken him in as an orphan, raising him as a son, albeit a son trained in the art of violence. His loyalty was to the man, not just the title. Now, he was driven by a singular purpose: vengeance. He had to unravel the conspiracy, find the true killer, and expose them before the empire Moretti built was reduced to ash. He was alone, hunted by his former comrades and the police, with only his wits and deadly skills to rely on. His investigation started in the grimy underbelly of the city, far from the mahogany-paneled offices of the capos. He called in old favors from informants, shook down low-level thugs, and pieced together whispers and rumors from the streets. He learned of a new player in town, a shadowy syndicate known only as the Vipers, who had been quietly making inroads into Moretti's territories. They were ghosts themselves, operating with ruthless efficiency and leaving no trail. Meanwhile, the war between the capos escalated. Lorenzo's traditional methods were no match for Isabella's financial warfare. She crippled his operations by manipulating stocks and cutting off his money laundering channels. Nico, impatient and reckless, launched a series of violent attacks on both, creating chaos but losing valuable soldiers and resources. The city was bleeding, and the Vipers were subtly profiting from the turmoil, absorbing territory and contacts that fell through the cracks. Marco's path eventually led him to a disillusioned accountant who once worked for Isabella. Terrified for his life, The man revealed a series of encrypted transactions between Isabella's shell corporations and an offshore account linked to the Vipers. The picture became horrifyingly clear. Isabella, the brilliant strategist, had orchestrated the entire affair. She had hired the Vipers to assassinate Don Moretti and Fray Marco. Knowing it would trigger a war, she was uniquely equipped to win. While Lorenzo and Nico fought with guns, she was fighting with ledgers and algorithms, bleeding them dry. Once they were eliminated, she planned to absorb the remnants of the family and forge a new, modern empire, with the Vipers as her silent partners. Armed with this damning evidence, Marco knew he couldn't just expose her. The capos wouldn't believe him, and Isabella had insulated herself too well. He needed to force her hand, to make her reveal her treachery in a way no one could deny. He devised a high-stakes plan. He arranged a meeting, a supposed parley between the three warring capos. Leaking the location through a trusted informant he knew was secretly on Isabella's payroll, he baited the trap, making it seem like he was cornered and ready to negotiate his own survival. The meeting took place in an abandoned warehouse district, under the pale glow of a full moon. Lorenzo and Nico arrived with their men, bristling with suspicion and weapons. Isabella arrived cool and collected, flanked by her own security. Marco appeared alone, stepping out from the shadows. He didn't plead or bargain. Instead, he presented his case, not to the capos, but to their men, laying out Isabella's betrayal, piece by piece. He spoke of her secret dealings with the Vipers, the money trail, the calculated plan to let them all destroy each other. Isabella laughed it off, as the desperate lies of a cornered killer. But just as she dismissed him, the warehouse doors burst open. It wasn't more of Marco's allies, it was the Vipers, but they weren't there to back up Isabella. Marco had made a different deal. He had contacted the Vipers' leader, offering them something far more valuable than a partnership with a treacherous capo. The entire Moretti empire, handed over, but under his terms. He had shown them how Isabella planned to eventually betray them. Seeing her allies turn on her, Isabella's composure finally cracked. In a moment of panic, she confirmed Marco's story, trying to command the Vipers, her supposed partners. It was the confession everyone needed to hear. In the chaos that followed, Lorenzo and Nico, realizing they had been pawns, turned their fury on Isabella. The war for succession ended right there, in a blaze of gunfire and broken alliances. When the smoke cleared, Marco Bellini stood as the sole survivor of the old guard's leadership. He had avenged Don Moretti, not by claiming the throne, but by purging the family of its own corruption. The Vipers, honoring their new pact, retreated into the shadows, leaving the city for him to command. Marco, the ghost who was once a killer, became a king. He rebuilt the Moretti family from the ground up, not with the old ways of fear, but with a new code of honor, loyalty, and ruthless justice. The lion was dead, but the ghost now reigned, his legend whispered on the streets of Viridia. A chilling reminder that in the world of shadows, loyalty is the only currency that truly matters. Thank you for watching this story unfold. If you enjoy tales of intrigue and power, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more. See you next time. The death of Tony Carbone changed everything. For years, the Mafia families of New York had maintained a fragile peace. There were disagreements, arguments, and occasional violence, but full-scale war had always been avoided. Now that peace was gone. By the next morning, word of the assassination had spread through every corner of the criminal underworld. Associates whispered about it in bars. Captains held emergency meetings. Soldiers began carrying extra weapons. Everyone knew what this meant. War was coming, and when Mafia wars started, the violence rarely stayed hidden for long. Incid. Salvatore De Luca's headquarters in Brooklyn. The atmosphere was tense. Several of his top captains were gathered around the table. None of them looked calm. Tony Carbone had been one of their strongest soldiers. His death was not just a loss, it was an insult, and insults in the Mafia world were paid back with blood. De Luca stood near the window, staring at the street below. His voice was quiet when he finally spoke. Any news? One of the captains shook his head. We're still asking around. Another man spoke up. Some people say Castellano's crew was seen nearby last night. De Luca slowly turned around. Some people? The captain hesitated. Nothing confirmed. De Luca slammed his fist against the table. I don't want rumors. I want names. Silence filled the room. Finally, another captain leaned forward. There's something else. Everyone looked at him. Romano's men have been moving around Queens all morning. De Luca frowned. Romano? Yes. That's strange, because Carlo Romano had always tried to stay neutral between the families. He was known for avoiding unnecessary violence. If Romano was suddenly moving soldiers through the streets, something serious was happening. De Luca thought for a moment. Then he gave a simple order. Follow them. Across the city, Carlo Romano was sitting inside his private office. Unlike De Luca, Romano was calm. Too calm. His trusted lieutenant stood across from him. The situation is getting worse, the lieutenant said. Romano nodded slowly. De Luca is already preparing for revenge in Castellano. Romano sighed. He's probably doing the same. The lieutenant looked confused, but if neither of them ordered the hit, Romano interrupted him. Then someone wants them to believe they did. The lieutenant fell silent, because that possibility was terrifying. It meant someone was manipulating the most powerful mafia families in New York. Someone smart, someone dangerous. Romano leaned back in his chair. If this continues, paus, the entire city will burn. Meanwhile, Victor Castellano had already begun making his own preparations. Inside a large warehouse near the docks, several of his soldiers were loading weapons into vehicles, boxers of pistols, shotguns, even automatic rifles. Castellano stood nearby, watching quietly. His advisor Paul Moreno approached him. This could turn into a disaster. Castellano didn't respond immediately. Instead, he watched as one of his soldiers closed the trunk of a car filled with weapons. Then he finally spoke. De Luca believes we killed Carbo Marino, nodded. And that means retaliation is coming. Marino looked worried. So what do we do? Castellano turned toward him. We survive. That same night, the violence began spreading through the streets. A small gambling operation in Queens was suddenly attacked by masked gunmen. 2 men were killed. Another was seriously injured. The attackers disappeared before the police arrived. Within an order, rumors began spreading. People believed the attack had been ordered by De Luca. Then another shooting happened. This time in Brooklyn. A bar connected to De Luca's organization was sprayed with gunfire. 3 soldiers were wounded. The city was slowly descending into chaos. Each attack led to another retaliation. Each retaliation created more anger. And soon, no one could remember who had fired the first shot. By midnight, the police were already overwhelmed. Detectives across New York began noticing the pattern. Multiple shootings. Connections to organized crime. Possible mafia conflict. One detective studying the reports looked at his partner. This feels like the start of something big. His partner nodded. Yeah, like a war. Meanwhile, inside his apartment, Marco Bellini sat quietly at his desk. A map of New York City was spread out in front of him. Several neighborhoods had been marked with small red circles. Each circle represented territory controlled by different families. Bellini slowly moved a small black marker across the map. Then he placed it directly in the center. Manhattan. The most valuable territory in the entire city. The place everyone wanted. Bellini smiled slightly, because the war had begun exactly the way he hoped. De Luca believed Castellano had started it. Castellano believed De Luca was preparing to attack. Romano was trying to stay neutral but was slowly being pulled into the conflict. And while the powerful bosses focused on each other, Bellini was quietly building his own power. He took a sip of his drink and looked at the television. News reporters were already discussing the violence spreading through the city. Authorities believe these incidents may be connected to organized crime activity. Bellini muted the television again. Everything was unfolding perfectly. The more chaos the war created, the weaker the old bosses would become, and eventually, when the fighting reached its peak, someone new would step forward. Someone younger. Someone smarter. Someone who had quietly started the entire conflict. Marco Bellini. But far across the city, inside a small restaurant in Manhattan, Don Lorenzo Ricci sat alone at a table. He had just received the news of the latest shootings. Ricci closed his eyes for a moment. Then he whispered something quietly. Fools, because Ricci understood something the others did not. This war had not started by accident. Someone had carefully created the situation. Someone had planned the assassination. Someone had manipulated the meeting, and now the entire Mafia world was walking directly into a trap. Ricci slowly stood up. He knew one thing for certain. If he didn't uncover the truth soon, New York City was about to witness the bloodiest Mafia war in decades. Within days, New York City began to feel the weight of the war. At first, the violence had been quiet. A shooting here, a disappearance there, but now the conflict was spreading faster than anyone expected. And once the killings started, they were impossible to stop. Early one morning in Brooklyn, a black sedan slowly pulled up outside a small coffee shop. Inside the shop sat Frankie Russo, one of Victor Castellano's trusted soldiers. Russo had just finished a meeting with 2 associates. He didn't notice the car outside. Across the street, 2 men stepped out of the sedan. Both wore dark jackets. Both carried pistols. They walked calmly toward the entrance of the coffee shop. Inside, Russo was laughing about something one of his friends had said. Then the door opened. The gunman stepped inside. For a split second, everyone froze. Then the shooting started. For loud gunshots shattered the quiet morning. Frankie Russo fell from his chair instantly. The gunman turned and ran out of the shop before anyone could react. Within seconds, the street exploded into chaos. People screamed. Chairs were knocked over. Someone called the police. But the attackers had already disappeared. Another killing. Another message. When Victor Castellano received the news, he didn't look surprised. He had expected retaliation. Still, the loss of another trusted soldier made the situation worse. Inside his office, Castellano slammed the newspaper against his desk. This is De Luca. Paul Moreno stood nearby. Probably. Castellano shook his head. No. Moreno looked confused. You don't think so? Castellano leaned back in his chair. This feels different. How too fast. Castellano had been in the Mafia world for decades. He understood how these wars usually began. Normally, there would be negotiations, threats, warnings. But this war had escalated immediately, almost as if someone was pushing both sides toward violence as quickly as possible, and that thought made him uneasy. Across the city, Salvatore De Luca was having similar thoughts. He had just heard about Frankie Russo's murder. One of his captains smiled slightly. Looks like Castellano got the message. But De Luca didn't smile. Instead, he stared at the floor quietly. Something about the situation didn't feel right. Carbone had been killed. Now Russo was dead. Both sides were losing important soldiers, but neither leader had actually ordered these hits, which meant someone else was responsible, and whoever it was, they were extremely dangerous. Meanwhile, the streets of New York were becoming more violent by the day. Gunfire echoed through neighborhoods late at night. Several bars connected to Mafia operations were attacked. A bookmaker was found dead in Queens. Another soldier disappeared in the Bronx. Even civilians had begun noticing the sudden rise in violence. The police were working overtime, trying to understand what was happening. Inside the police department, detectives studied reports from across the city. One investigator pointed at a map filled with red pins. All these shootings are connected. His partner nodded. Organized crime. But which family? The detective sighed. Probably all of them. While the war continued to grow, Don Lorenzo Ricci had begun his own investigation. Ricci was older than the other bosses. He had survived many conflicts during his long career, and he understood something important about wars. They rarely started by accident. Someone always benefited. Inside his private office, Ricci spoke quietly with one of his most trusted men. I want information. About who? Ricci thought for a moment. Everyone. The man nodded. I'll start asking questions. Ricci stopped him before he left. Be careful. Why? Ricci looked directly at him. Because the man behind this war He paused. He's smarter than the rest of us. Meanwhile, in his apartment, Marco Bellini watched the chaos unfold like a chess game. The television news was filled with reports about violence in the city. Bellini sat at the table with his map of New York. Several new marks had been added. Each mark represented another attack, another death, another step toward total war. Bellini took a sip of whiskey and smiled slightly. Everything was moving exactly as he predicted. The old bosses were reacting emotionally. They were blaming each other, preparing retaliation, making mistakes. And while they fought each other, Bellini's own crew was quietly expanding, taking over abandoned operations, recruiting soldiers from weaker crews, building power in the shadows. Soon, the balance of power in New York would collapse completely. And when it did, someone new would rise to the top, someone who had never officially declared war, someone who had simply allowed the others to destroy themselves. Marco Vigini, but far across the city, Don Lorenzo Ricci had just received new information. His trusted man rushed into the office. "I found something." Ricci looked up. "What?" The man hesitated. One of the shooters from the coffee shop was seen meeting someone last week. Ricci leaned forward. "Who?" The man slowly said the name. Ricci's eyes widened slightly, because the name he heard was unexpected. Very unexpected. If the information was true, then the entire war had been built on a lie, and the real mastermind behind the bloodshed was someone no one suspected. Ricci slowly stood up. This war just became much more dangerous. In the concrete heart of New York City, a storm is brewing. For decades, a fragile peace has held the five families in a delicate balance of power, but that peace has just shattered. All-out war has erupted on the streets, turning neighborhoods into battlegrounds. Gunshots echo in the night, deals go sour, and soldiers on both sides are falling like dominoes. At the center of this bloody conflict are two of the city's most formidable bosses, Salvatore De Luca, the old guard traditionalist, and Victor Castellano. They've been rivals for years, but something has pushed them over the edge, igniting a war that threatens to burn the entire underworld to the ground. What could have possibly triggered such a catastrophic feud? The answer lies not with the Dons themselves, but with a new player, someone moving silently in the shadows. His name is Marco Bellini. To the world, he's just an ambitious bandacomer, a young lion with a hunger for power. But Bellini is more than just ambitious. He's a master puppeteer. While De Luca and Castellano see each other as the enemy, they are blind to the fact that Bellini is pulling their strings, playing them against each other with cunning precision. He's whispering poison into their ears, staging betrayals, and fabricating insults. Let's look at how it started. A major shipment belonging to De Luca's family goes missing from the docks. The word on the street, carefully planted by Bellini's men, is that Castellano's crew was seen in the area right before it vanished. De Luca, a man ruled by pride and tradition, sees this as an unforgivable act of aggression. He retaliates swiftly, hitting one of Castellano's key smuggling routes. Castellano, who believes he's been unjustly targeted, strikes back with even greater force. This is the deadly cycle Bellini has engineered. He feeds De Luca's paranoia about Castellano's modern methods, telling him Castellano sees him as a relic of the past. At the same time, he tells Castellano that De Luca will never respect his ambition and wants to keep him under his thumb forever. Every move, every counter-move, is a step in Bellini's grand design. He orchestrates a failed assassination attempt on one of De Luca's top captains and makes it look like Castellano is handiwork. He then leaks false information to Castellano, suggesting De Luca is planning to wipe out his entire family. Each lie is a match thrown onto a puddle of gasoline. The two Dons, blinded by rage and grief, are too busy fighting each other to see the real threat. They are dismantling their own empires, weakening their forces, and spending their resources on a war that has no winner. And with every fallen soldier, every busted operation, Marco Bellini gets one step closer to his ultimate goal, to watch them destroy each other so he can rise from the ashes and claim the throne for himself. But in the world of shadows and secrets, there are always those who watch from the sidelines. Don Lorenzo Ricci, the head of the oldest and most respected family, has remained neutral in the conflict. He's a man of wisdom and patience, known as the Owl, for his ability to see things others miss, while De Luca and Castellano are consumed by their war. Ricci has been observing. He finds it strange that the conflict escalated so quickly, so violently. The moves are too clean, the provocations too perfect. It all feels orchestrated. Ricci doesn't believe that two experienced bosses like De Luca and Castellano would be so reckless without a hidden hand guiding them toward mutual destruction. Ricci begins his own quiet investigation. He calls in old favors, speaks to trusted informants who operate in the city's deepest crevices. He doesn't look for soldiers or guns. He looks for whispers, patterns, and inconsistencies. His most trusted advisor, a man who has served the Ricci family for 50 years, starts to piece together the puzzle. They notice that one name keeps popping up in the periphery of every incident: Marco Bigini. He's always nearby, always has an alibi, but his presence is a constant thread connecting the chaotic events. He's been seen talking to disgruntled members of both families, offering them promises of power and wealth once the dust settles. The final piece of evidence comes from an unlikely source. A low-level bookie, terrified for his life, comes to Ricci. He overheard a conversation he was unsupposed to hear, one of Baini's lieutenants bragging about how their boss was playing the two dons like fiddles. The bookie provides details that align perfectly with Ricci's suspicions. He confirms that Bellini's men were behind the stolen shipment that started the war and the fake assassination attempt that poured fuel on the fire. The picture is now crystal clear. This isn't a war between De Luca and Castellano. It's a coup, orchestrated by a young wolf who was clever enough to turn the lions against each other. Don Ricci now faces a critical choice. He could let the war continue, watch his rivals weaken, and strengthen his own position. It would be the safe play. But Ricci is a man of honor, and he understands that Bellini's treachery threatens the very foundation of their world. A leader who rises through such deceit is a danger to everyone. He knows that if Bellini succeeds, no one will be safe. The old rules will be meaningless, and the city will be plunged into an era of unpredictable chaos. Ricci decides he must intervene. But how? Approaching De Luca or Castellano directly is too risky. They are so deep in their blood feud that they wouldn't believe him. They would likely see it as a trick, another move in the great game. So, Ricci devises a plan. He can't just tell them the truth. He has to show them. He needs to set a trap, not for De Luca or Castellano, but for Marco Bellini himself. He needs to lure Bellini into making a move that exposes his hand to everyone. Ricci arranges a secret meeting, supposedly with a corrupt union boss who has information to sell. He knows Bellini's network of spies will pick up on it. The bait is that this union boss has proof of Castellano planning a final, devastating attack on De Luca's family. It asks the kind of information Bellini would want to get his hands on to deliver the final blow in his manipulative game. The stage is set in an old, abandoned warehouse by the River Neutro ground. Bellini, confident and arrogant, believes he is one step away from victory. He arrives, expecting to meet the union boss and acquire the information that will seal De Luca's fate. But as he steps inside, the heavy steel doors slam shut behind him. The warehouse is not empty. Standing in the center, under a single hanging light, are not only Don Ricci and his men, but also Salvatore De Luca and Victor Castellano. For the first time in months, the two warring dons are in the same room, their faces etched with confusion and hate, but their animosity is slowly replaced by dawning realization as they look from Ricci to a suddenly pale Marco Bellini. The trap has been sprung. Don Ricci steps forward, his voice calm but carrying the weight of absolute authority. He lays out the entire deception, piece by piece, from the stolen shipment to the fabricated rumors. He presents the evidence he has gathered, the testimony from the bookie, and the patterns of betrayal that all lead back to one man. De Luca and Castellano listen, their anger toward each other slowly turning into a cold, focused rage. Directed at Bellini, they see how they've been manipulated, how their pride and grief were used as weapons against them. The man they saw as a promising young talent was, in fact, the architect of their downfall. Marco Bigini, caught and exposed, knows there is no way out. The ambition that drove him has now become his death sentence. In that warehouse, surrounded by the very men he sought to destroy, his short and bloody reign comes to an end. The war between the De Luca and Castellano families is over, but the scars will remain. A new, fragile peace settles over the city, born from the shared realization of their near destruction. Don Lorenzo Rixidiao has restored order, but everyone knows the underworld has been changed forever. The old ways were challenged, and while they survive this time, the question lingers in the air. Who will be the next Marco Bellini, waiting in the shadows for their chance to rise? The game never truly ends. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this dive into the criminal underworld, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories from the shadows. Let me know in the comments what you think of Don Ricci's strategy. Until next time, stay behealing. By the second week of the war, New York City had become a very different place. The streets were still full of people. The lights still shined across Manhattan, and the traffic continued to move through the avenues. But beneath the surface, fear had begun spreading. People connected to the criminal underworld were suddenly disappearing. Bars and restaurants that had once been safe meeting places were now being watched carefully. Every Mafia soldier in the city was nervous, because nobody knew who would be the next target. Inside the Salvatore De Luca's headquarters in Brooklyn, the mood had turned dark. 3 of his soldiers had been killed in the warehouse ambush. Someone inside his own organization had clearly betrayed him, and De Luca was determined to find out who it was. Late one night, 2 of his men dragged a frightened associate into the back room of the building. The man had been quietly working as a messenger for one of De Luca's captains. Now he sat tied to a chair, shaken. De Luca slowly walked into the room. The lights were dim. The air smelled of smoke and alcohol. De Luca sat down in front of the man. "You know why you're here?" The associate shook his head quickly. "I swear I don't know anything." De Luca stared at him for several seconds. Then he nodded to one of his men. The man stepped forward and punched the associate hard in the stomach. The prisoner gasped for air. De Luca spoke calmly. "Someone told Castellano about our attack on the docks. I want to know who." The associate looked terrified. "I don't know." Another punch landed. Then another. The man began coughing. Finally, he broke. Okay. De Luca leaned forward. "Talk." The associate hesitated. Then he whispered a name. The room went silent. One of De Luca's captains slowly stood up, because the name the man had given belonged to someone they all knew. Someone who had been working with them for years. Someone they trusted. Asterisk Frank Marino. Frank Marino was one of De Luca's own captains. Meanwhile, across the city, Frank Marino was sitting in his car outside a quiet restaurant. He looked calm, but his mind was racing. For months, he had secretly been feeding information to Victor Castellano. At first, it had been about small things, shipment times, meeting locations, nothing too dangerous. But after the war started, the information had become more valuable and more deadly. Marino believed he was making the smart move. If Castellano won the war, Marino would be rewarded. If De Luca survived, Marino planned to claim he had simply been misled. But what Marino didn't realize was that De Luca had already discovered the truth. Inside De Luca's office, the atmosphere was deadly quiet. The captain who heard the name finally spoke. "Marino." De Luca nodded slowly. "Yes." Another captain looked shocked. "That's impossible." But De Luca knew better. In the Mafia world, betrayal was always possible, even from people you trusted. De Luca stood up slowly. "Bring him to me." Meanwhile, Don Lorenzo Ricci had begun making his own dangerous plans. After discovering Marco Bellini's possible role in the war, Ricci knew he couldn't act too quickly. Bellini was clever. If he realized someone suspected him, he would disappear immediately. So Ricci decided to do something different. He started watching Bellini quietly, tracking his movements, his meetings, his allies. And what Ricci discovered worried him deeply. Bellini had been building relationships with soldiers from multiple families. Men who were frustrated by the war. Men who wanted new leadership. Bellini wasn't just manipulating the conflict. He was preparing to take control when the war ended. Ricci whispered quietly to himself. The kid wants the whole city. Later that night, Frank Marino finally arrived at De Luca's headquarters. He'd received a message saying, De Luca wanted to discuss the next move in the war. Marino walked into the building confidently. But something immediately felt wrong. The hallway was unusually quiet. Too quiet. Before he could react, two large men grabbed him from behind. Moreno struggled. What the hell is this? They dragged him into the back room. When the door opened, Moreno saw De Luca sitting at the table. And suddenly he understood. De Luca looked at him calmly. You've been busy lately. Moreno tried to remain calm. What do you mean, De Luca? Placed a pistol on the table, talking to Castellano. The color drained from Moreno's face. That's not true. De Luca nodded to the associate tied in the chair nearby. The beaten man looked up weakly. That's him. Moreno realized he had no escape. His voice became desperate. Listen. I can explain. De Luca raised his hand. Silence. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then De Luca finally spoke. You betrayed your family. In the Mafia world, betrayal had only one punishment. Marino now Italiano. Everyone in the room knew it. Marino tried one last time. I was trying to protect us. The gunshot echoed through the room. Frank Moreno collapsed to the floor. Dead. De Luca slowly stood up. Now, he said quietly, we send Castellano a message. Across the city, Victor Castellano had just finished another meeting when Paul Moreno rushed into the room. We lost contact with Frank. Castellano looked up when 2 hours ago. Castellano's expression darkened. If Frank Moreno had been captured, it meant De Luca now knew about the betrayal. And that meant the war was about to become even more violent. Castellano whispered quietly, so it begins. Meanwhile, Marco Bellini stood on the balcony of a luxury apartment overlooking Manhattan. Below him, the city lights sparkled in the darkness. But Bellini knew the truth. Behind those lights, men were dying every night. Families were losing soldiers. The old bosses were becoming weaker. Exactly as he planned. But Bellini also knew something else. Someone had begun investigating the war. Someone smart. Someone patient. Don Lorenzo Ricci. Bellini smiled slightly. Interesting, because the final stage of his plan was approaching. And soon, only one boss would remain standing. The city had become a battlefield. Gunfire echoed through Brooklyn, Queens, and parts of Manhattan. Mafia soldiers moved in groups, patrolling streets that had once been safe. Every night, new deaths occurred. And every morning, New Yorkers woke up to another headline about shootings, fires, or assassinations. The war had reached its most violent stage. Yet, inside Salvatore De Luca's headquarters, the mood was tense. Reports had just arrived about another attack. This time, one of Castellano's warehouses had been destroyed. Several of Castellano's soldiers were dead. De Luca slammed his fist on the table. They think they can intimidate us, he growled. One of his captains nodded. They're making mistakes. Boss. De Luca's eyes narrowed. Mistakes? No. This is exactly what they want. They want retaliation. They want blood. And we will give it to them, on our terms. Plans for retaliation immediately began. Targets were selected, streets were mapped, and soldiers were briefed. By midnight, multiple teams were moving toward Castellano's operations. Across the city, Victor Castellano was not idle. He had already received intelligence about De Luca's movements. Inside his office, Castellano observed a map of Brooklyn. Soldiers were being dispatched to intercept De Luca's forces. A small smile appeared on his face. The city was burning, but Castellano knew how to exploit chaos. This war, he said quietly to Paul Moreno, is a test of endurance. The one who strikes smarter survives. Meanwhile, Marco Bellini continued to manipulate events from the shadows, while the old bosses fought each other openly. Bellini had quietly begun consolidating his own power. Small businesses in neutral neighborhoods suddenly became part of his network. Soldiers who were frustrated with the violence started joining him secretly. Bellini's power base was growing without drawing any attention. He moved like a shadow through the city, patient and calculating. Every death, every ambush, Every retaliation only made it easier for him to expand. The old families were too busy killing each other to notice the rising king. Don Lorenzo Ricci had been monitoring Bellini's movements. After discovering Marino's betrayal and death, Ricci realized Bellini was likely behind the entire war. Ricci had begun quietly gathering intelligence. Surveillance on Bellini's allies, checking financial transactions, tracing weapons, shipments. Every clue brought him closer to understanding the mastermind. But Ricci knew he had to move carefully. Bellini was clever. One wrong move, and Ricci could become the next target. That night, the first massive retaliation began. De Luca's men ambushed one of Castellano's smaller warehouses in Queens. Gunfire erupted, bullets tearing through crates of weapons and explosives. Castellano's men fired back. The streets became a battlefield. Civilians were forced to hide inside their homes as gunfire echoed through the streets. Several soldiers were killed on both sides. The message was clear. The war had no boundaries. Back in Manhattan, Bellini watched everything unfold from his office. A map of the city was spread out in front of him. Red and blue pins marked the territories of Castellano and De Luca. But Bellini's pins were growing steadily. Neighborhoods that were once neutral were quietly becoming his. And the two older bosses, Didente e Benotis. Bellini took a sip of whiskey and smiled. "The chaos makes everything simpler," he whispered. Meanwhile, Ricci had just received intelligence about a key Castellano lieutenant who had been assassinated. The timing suggested Bellini's hand was behind the hit. Ricci's suspicions were confirmed. He quietly told his men, "Bellini is the architect, and if we don't act, he will control everything." Plans were made. Ricci would not confront Bellini openly yet. Instead, he began gathering a network of allies willing to move secretly against the rising mastermind. By dawn, the city had changed. Neighborhoods that were once quiet were now controlled by bullets and fear. The streets had become the stage for the deadliest Mafia war in decades. And in the shadows, Marco Beginius' empire quietly grew. Every step he had taken had been calculated. Every move had been planned. The old bosses were too blinded by revenge to see the larger picture. Bellini was patient. Bellini was smart, and Bellini was ready. The final act of the war had begun. By now, New York had become unrecognizable. Streets that were once lively were now silent, except for the occasional echo of gunfire. Neighborhoods were divided by loyalty, fear, and territory. And the two old bosses, Salvatore De Luca and Victor Castellano, were locked in a full-scale war. In Brooklyn, De Luca's forces moved like shadows in the night. Motorcycles carrying armed soldiers zipped through narrow alleys. Cars sped down abandoned streets, carrying weapons and explosives. Every attack was precise, every ambush carefully planned. De Luca had decided there would be no more hesitation. Meanwhile, in Queens, Castellano had fortified his positions. Warehouses were barricaded. Snipers were placed on rooftops. Every exit was monitored. Castellano had learned quickly. De Luca's retaliation was ruthless, and he would not allow it to overwhelm him. Inside his office, Castellano spoke quietly to Paul Moreno as a replacement lieutenant. "They think they can crush me," he said, eyes burning. "They are wrong." The first major battle erupted near the docks. De Luca's soldiers ambushed one of Castellano's cargo ships. Gunfire lit the night. Explosions rocked the piers. Bodies fell on both sides. 4 hours, neither boss would give in. By dawn, dozens lay dead. Neighborhoods were littered with debris and blood, and still, the war showed no sign of ending. High above the chaos, Marco Bellini watched it all unfold. From his penthouse in Manhattan, he observed the city like a chessboard. Each battle between De Luca and Castellano only strengthened his position. Neighborhoods were weakened. Soldiers were killed or injured. Those who survived were tired, angry, and desperate. Perfect conditions for Bellini to rise. He smiled slightly, sipping whiskey. "Soon," he whispered, "they will be too busy fighting each other to notice me." Meanwhile, Don Lorenzo Ricci had moved closer to uncovering Bellini's role. Through a network of spies and informants, He began piecing together the young mastermind's moves. He discovered Bellini had manipulated both De Luca and Castellano from the start. Bellini had been present at the first secret meeting, asking the right questions, planting doubt. Every ambush, every assassination, every act of retaliation was subtly orchestrated to benefit Bellini. Ricci knew one thing. He had to act quickly. If Bellini gained full control, the old families would be powerless. And Ricci could not allow that. As night fell again, De Luca and Castellano prepared for another clash. De Luca's men had located one of Castellano's supply convoys moving through Brooklyn. Gunmen lay in wait. When the convoy appeared, bullets tore through the vehicles. Explosions set crates on fire. Castellano's men fought back fiercely. Several soldiers on both sides were killed instantly. The city streets became a battlefield. Amidst this chaos, Ricci made his move. Using a network of loyal soldiers from neutral factions, he began shadowing Bellini's associates. Every meeting, every transaction, every movement was tracked. Ricci's goal was clear: expose Bellini before he could claim total control. But Bellini was clever. He had hidden his actions behind layers of secrecy, leaving no obvious trail. By midnight, both De Luca and Castellano were exhausted. Their soldiers were battered, their resources dwindling, but neither would back down. Every street was dangerous. Every encounter could be the last. Meanwhile, Bellini quietly began taking control of key neutral neighborhoods. Businesses, warehouses, and street operations were quietly shifted under his influence. The old bosses didn't notice, too consumed with revenge to see the real threat rising. Ricci finally received confirmation. One of Bellini's lieutenants had been spotted coordinating with both De Luca and Castellano's forces. It was clear Bellini had orchestrated the war from the very beginning. Ricci realized the final act was near. He whispered to his men, "Prepare for the confrontation. The city is about to change forever." By dawn, the battle lines had shifted. De Luca and Castellano had lost more than 50 soldiers between them. Entire neighborhoods had been abandoned. Civilians hid in terror as the streets ran red with blood. And high above it all, Marco Bellini's empire grew quietly, methodically, perfectly. The old bosses were blind to the bigger picture. The city was descending into chaos. And in the shadows, the young mastermind waited, ready to claim what he had orchestrated from the very start. The city had become a war zone. Brooklyn, Queens, and Manhattan were littered with debris. Smoke rose from burning warehouses. Police sirens wailed in the distance, but even they seemed powerless to stop the carnage. The Mafia war had reached its peak. Inside Salvatore De Luca's headquarters, the mood was grim. Most of his top lieutenants had been killed in the past weeks. Supplies were running low, but De Luca refused to surrender. He gathered the remaining soldiers and gave a single command: "Tonight, we end this." Meanwhile, Victor Castellano had fortified his remaining positions. Snipers, armed guards, and hidden explosives surrounded his key territories. He had lost much, but he still controlled vital supply lines. Castellano knew one thing: De Luca was desperate, and desperate men were dangerous. High above the chaos, Marco Bellini watched quietly from his penthouse. The city below was fighting itself to death. Every soldier lost, every neighborhood devastated, was part of his plan. Bellini had not fired a single shot directly. He didn't need to. The old bosses were doing the killing for him. Soon, only he would remain. Don Lorenzo Ricci had spent weeks tracking Bellini. Finally, he had a chance to confront the young mastermind. Ricci met his most trusted men in a hidden warehouse in the Bronx. "This ends tonight," Ricci said quietly. "We expose him. We stop him before he takes the entire city." Meanwhile, in Brooklyn, De Luca's remaining soldiers moved toward Castellano's last stronghold. Gunfire erupted immediately. Bullets tore through the night. De Luca's men fought with desperation, knowing they had little left to lose. Castellano's forces countered with equal fury. The streets became a massacre. During the battle, Ricci made his move. He infiltrated one of Bellini's secret safe houses. Inside, he found proof of Bellini's manipulation. Asterix maps of territories, Asterix records of assassinations Asterix. Notes detailing who would attack, whom Ricci realized the full scale of Bellini's plan. He's been controlling this war from the start, Ricci whispered. At the height of the battle, De Luca and Castellano faced each other for the first time in weeks. Why are you still alive? De Luca shouted. You started this war. Castellano growled. Mia, you think I started it? Neither realized the true mastermind was still out of reach. Bellini's soldiers quietly seized abandoned positions during the fighting. Every step they took gave Bellini more power. Finally, Ricci confronted Bellini in a skyscraper overlooking Manhattan. Bellini was calm, as if he had expected this moment. You're too late, Bellini said, smiling. Ricci drew his weapon. You caused this chaos. Thousands dead because of you. Bellini shrugged. They were going to fight anyway. I just accelerated the process. I cleared the board. Ricci's hands shook. New York doesn't belong to you. Bellini laughed softly. Not yet, but it will. Back in the streets, the battle between De Luca and Castellano reached its climax. Both sides were exhausted. Corpses lay everywhere. The few remaining soldiers realized their leaders had been manipulated. But it was too late. Ricci attempted to arrest Bellini. But Bellini had anticipated the move. A distraction pulled Ricci's men away, and Bellini disappeared into the shadows. The city below was silent for a moment, almost holding its breath. When the dust settled, Asterisk Salvatore De Luca was severely wounded, forced to retreat. Asterisk Victor Castellano had lost his strongest soldiers, retreating to safe territory. Asterisk Marco Bellini had gained control of key neighborhoods and operations. Asterisk Don Lorenzo Ricci had uncovered the truth, but could not stop Bellini immediately. The old bosses were weakened. The young mastermind had risen. Weeks later, the city slowly recovered. Police cleaned up the streets. Businesses reopened, but the power balance had shifted. Bellini now controlled the major neighborhoods. Soldiers from all sides, tired of the endless war, quietly joined him. From the shadows, he became the new king of New York's criminal underworld. He had started nothing but whispers and manipulated events. He had never fired a shot directly. Yet, when the war ended, he alone remained standing. Don Lorenzo Ricci watched from a distance. He had survived, but he knew one thing. The era of old bosses was over. The city had a new ruler, and Bellini's name would be feared for generations. The war was over. The streets of New York had been cleansed by chaos, but a new order had risen. Bellini's patience, strategy, and cunning had turned the city into his empire. And the story of the Mafia war, sparked by a secret meeting, would become legend. New York had a new king, Marco Bellini.